Welcome to Book Club. I'm really into fun facts. Julie has an endless array of pop culture knowledge. Overall, I would say I liked it.
Something about the way she writes is like really concrete and immediate. Who is this man? Why is he in this costume? Like, why did he drop a squid? Like, you teased some juicy deets about the creation of this book.
This is, again, what Victoria finds interesting, not what is actually most important about these people.
What stories are we going to tell ourselves about this year?
Welcome to the party.
Welcome, guys.
Welcome to Book Club.
With Julia.
And Victoria.
We are two roommates and friends since high school who read a book and talk about it each episode.
This is a podcast where we explore new perspectives and use books as a tool for personal and community growth.
This week we are talking about We Were 8 Years in Power, an American Tragedy by Ta-Nehisi Coates. We're going to be talking about the book as a whole. There's a lot of details that will be missed.
There's a lot.
There's so many. So honestly, I don't know how much of it is going to be spoiled, but if you care about essay spoilers, then...
Yeah, Obama became the president.
Yeah.
And then he wasn't the president.
Yeah.
I
don't know if there's a lot of spoilers in this book, but just in case, this is your official warning.
I'm thinking back, what can we spoil? The Civil War? No.
Yeah, it's
Michelle Obama as a person? No.
Maybe the thing that will spoil is your sense of pride in your country.
Maybe. In that case, stick around.
Does that sound enthralling to you? Stick around.
Yeah. So, as Julie mentioned, this is kind of going to be an overview episode of what this collection of essays is doing, and we'll get into some of the details of specific essays in here, but there's some that we definitely want to revisit in future episodes. So, if you're like, hey, they kind of just brushed over what really is being discussed in a handful of these essays, don't worry, we want to come back to them in future seasons of the podcast.
Hi, friends. So, we messed up. This is future Julie and Victoria.
Yes. Typically at this part in the episode, you would hear us talk about our experience reading a book. This time, Ta-Nehisi Coates, We Were 8 Years in Power. However, I think I put my phone too close to the box where we plug in our microphones, connects to our computer. It's called an interface. We call it the box. Anyways,
the box.
It sounds like robots took over our bodies.
Yeah.
The audio is so horrendous, we do not want to share it with you.
It sounds really bad.
But we promise you that we read this book. Well, actually, Julie read more of it than I did.
Yeah.
I think I admitted in the section that got cut out that I hadn't quite finished it.
Yeah.
So yeah, we learned a lot reading this book.
We read the book and we had an experience.
Yeah.
And it was generally good enough that we wanted to talk about it
On this podcast. So yeah, here's the rest of the episode.
Hope you enjoy! As she gets out her phone.
I have notes too. This first part is from Ta-Nehisi Coates' website.
Okay.
Ta-Nehisi Coates is a distinguished writer in residence at NYU's Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute. He is the author of the best-selling books The Beautiful Struggle, We Were 8 Years in Power, and Between the World and Me, which won the National Book Award in 2015. His first novel, The Water Dancer, was released in September 2019, and Ta-Nehisi is a recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship. He is also the current author of the Marvel Comics The Black Panther and Captain America. Also in the news this week, Ta-Nehisi Coates is writing the screenplay for the new Superman movie that's going to be coming out.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be Black Superman, which will be pretty cool.
Yeah. I really enjoy that he has sort of left his essay days behind and has dived headfirst into the nerd world. He published a novel and now he's fully comic book Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Yeah.
And it makes my heart really happy for him. I really hope he's really enjoying what he's doing and exploring new pastures. He's covered every single type of writing that you could do. Yeah. Except poetry.
Well, actually,
no?
He started writing poetry when he was 17. That's kind of his first
Wow! Okay, so he's done
writing.
It all.
He's done it all.
Amazing.
I think he has to do a stage play.
Okay. He has to pull an August Wilson.
TV show.
Oh, a TV show. Yeah.
But almost ticking the boxes.
Yeah.
A little bit more background. He was born in Baltimore, Maryland in 1975. His mother was a teacher and his father was a librarian, entrepreneur, and publisher. His dad founded Black Classic Press, which printed a lot of African American writers and more less popular works, not the big names. He enrolled at Howard University, but left without a degree, and he married his wife Kenyatta Matthews, and they have one son together. So that's a little bit of background on our author today.
This book is primarily marketed as and described as, this is 8 essays, one from each year of Obama's presidency, that Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote during his time with The Atlantic. And that is what's in it. That is what's there, but...
Not wrong, but not fully right.
Right, that's really only like half the book. The other half is before each essay, he has a section called notes. So there's notes from the first year, notes from the second year, notes from the third year. So you sort of track time, but these notes are written from quote-unquote present day. So like 2017, 2018, when this was published, or getting ready to be published.
Yeah, it was published in 2017.
2017. Okay. Yeah. I imagine 2016, 2017. He's writing from a post, like, Trump has been elected by the time he's finished writing this. He sort of takes that lens of kind of the tragic arc of Obama's presidency and how Coates has grown as a writer. He's sort of made it, quote unquote. He's made it to the status and he's able to like feed his family and pay his rent with writing, which was really the main goal. So he's kind of doing the thing. So from that perspective, he's sort of looking back on where he started at the beginning of Obama's presidency and where this essay writing for The Atlantic came from. And then he sort of analyzes his own writing. Like there's one essay in which he talks about the kind of spirit of hip hop. And so in the notes section beforehand, he talks about the way that hip hop was kind of the first literature that he was exposed to, and he would analyze the lyrics and he would practice writing it for himself. And like that's what taught him how to be a writer. And so he gives you that background information before you read this essay. And so you're getting kind of his story, and you're also getting context. As much as it's an essay collection, it's also like a memoir in a way, and it's really fascinating. Like, I think as much as they should teach this book in like, American history classes and like all sorts of social science related classes, they should also teach this in writing classes.
Yeah, it's almost like the essays could be pulled out and you would read A Case for Reparations in your history class or your sociology class, but you would read the whole collection for your literature class or your writing class. Yes,
because it's like you learn a lot from watching his craft develop and how he sees it now. If I were to like put a tagline, I would focus more on him, and I would say like the rise of modern day Baldwin or something, because that's what you're watching. Yeah. You're watching him become the writer that he is, and it's amazing. So that's really what this book is there's you're kind of watching these two simultaneous arcs. You're watching the narrative arc of Obama's presidency that has a tragic ending, and you're watching the narrative arc of his writing career, his early writing career.
This podcast is made possible by our fantastic book club members. You can support the show by becoming a member on buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv. Starting at $3 per month, book club members can connect with fellow listeners, help us select books for future episodes, unlock exclusive posts and messages, get early and discounted access to future events, and more. And if you want to take your support to the next level, you can join the TISM tier, which starts at $5 per month. The TISM tier is all about autism. Are you an autistic person looking for community? A possible neurodiverse person looking for resources? Or an ally hoping to learn more from an actually autistic person? Members of this tier get free access to Julia's autism-related articles on Medium. The best part of any book club, besides the books, is the community. So join us in our growing community of book nerds by becoming a member of the book club today. Follow the link in our show notes or go to buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv to join the party. That's buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv. We'll see you there. So as we were prepping for this episode,
yes,
you very beautifully were drawing with your words the plot arc of this collection. Yeah. And as the subtitle says, he's writing a tragedy and discussing the American tragedy. I thought it was a really interesting way to approach this collection as a whole, because it's kind of the tragic arc that you see of understanding and peeling back the layers of American history and realizing that we are living a tragedy. Also, this arc of his own journey, as you were describing, as a writer, and his own understanding as a person, like kind of coming to terms with his own history and his own life.
Yeah. Like what he uncovers as he writes these. So what will you end up with? Because we wrestled with this for a long time. Because like there are lessons that you learned from individual essays. But then what do we learn at the end of this book when we get to the end, particularly after reading The First White President, which is the epilogue, and it's an essay about Trump and making a parallel between the Trump era and the antebellum era, and you're like, where does this leave us? What did we learn? And what we kind of landed on was the importance of context and nuance to kind of fight against the kind of narrative of whiteness and the false narrative of our country that we've all sort of been taught and bought into and perpetuated and kept telling. And so you see that narrative play out on the, political scale with Obama, and then you see that play out on a personal scale in Coates's own journey as a writer and kind of the implications of, he's sort of digging for this information, and then when he finds it, he has to kind of deal with the implications of it. So, yeah.
It's all context.
Yeah.
All about context.
It's all about context. So, we're going to sort of build that. We're going to try and paint that picture for you over our little plot mountain.
Yeah. Come along on this plot mountain journey.
Yeah. We're going mountain climbing.
So, our exposition.
It's like really the first 4 years, which is a very long exposition.
Exposition and rising action, perhaps?
Yeah.
We start with Ta-Nehisi Coates. In his personal life, things are hard. He's having a hard time finding employment as a writer. He's just trying to basically get his foot in the door somewhere. And the first essay that he writes for the blog that he has with The Atlantic, at least I believe it's the first one he wrote, at least maybe the first one they published in their print publication? I don't know.
My understanding is he'd been writing for a while, but this essay is the first one that got him attention and got him the gig with The Atlantic.
Gotcha. The title's in quotes. This is how we lost to the white man. And in my mind, I'm always like the Bill Cosby essay.
Yeah.
That's how I remember it. And what we get from this approach towards his essay collection, when he gives these kind of like reflective notes on like who he was at the time of writing it, what his life circumstances were, but also his critiques of his own writing, which are really fascinating. I think a lot of us creators, going back to your even more recent work, but especially your older work, you just kind of cringe a little bit.
Yeah.
I was talking with someone who works for a startup, and he was quoting, I believe it's like the person who founded LinkedIn, but saying if your first product doesn't make you cringe, basically you're not doing it right. Or like your first product should make you cringe, like when you send it out to the world, because it has so much more that it can become, and you look back on it with like, oh, it was a starting place, but we've got some work to do. And that's kind of what you see from Ta-Nehisi Coates in his letters from the first year of like, this is what I messed up in this essay. I just breezed over Bill Cosby's, at the time, allegations of sexual assault. He just kind of like breezed past them, and he notes, and he's like, I like definitely misstepped in this essay, but it does kind of give you a starting place of like where he's at.
Yeah, I found that fascinating that he starts the book with an essay he doesn't like. I'm like, what a what a move as an artist. I mean, it probably softens the blow that he can tell us he doesn't like it.
Yeah, he doesn't have to just start with it and then like, I didn't really like the first one, but okay.
Yeah, at least he can tell us like this isn't any good. That's okay. So he has control of the narrative still. But it's an interesting starting place because you read it and you can see the sort of seeds of the ideas that he's trying to wrestle with, but he doesn't have all the information yet. And so he's speaking from what he knows. You know, looking back from what he knows now, he's like, yeah, I really missed the mark with this one. But he was just trying. And that really, really struck me when I read it, because I got to the end of the essay, I was like, yeah, this isn't as good as other work that I've read of yours. But it was still interesting. You know, there was still something that I could kind of wrestle with and be like, I don't really agree with you here, but you probably also don't agree with that anymore. And it left so much room for critique, but also like for, you know, you outgrow your ideas and you outgrow your writing, and it creates a narrative arc out of an essay collection, which is just wild. Because if he started with where he ends up, with sort of the culmination of all of these 8 years of all of this work, then like he would have nowhere to go, and that wouldn't be very interesting. The second one in there is American Girl. He likes this one a little bit more. He still seems a little dissatisfied with it. I found this one fascinating, and I used it quite a bit because I read this essay before I read Becoming. And so it informed a lot of my like analysis of how she talks about herself.
Yeah, it was interesting reading this one. Well, I listened to this one on audiobook, but it was obviously after we read Becoming. And so to me, there was like, I don't know, there wasn't a whole lot that stood out because like I felt like I already knew a lot of her story and had a general impression of how she was viewed, as far as like you mentioned, the element of her kind of being the, like, if people go around questioning, you know, Obama's citizenship or like how American is he really, like son of an immigrant, that are unfounded, she kind of like anchors their family as like, you know, as the title suggests, like American Girl, like all American. I also found it interesting his critiques of himself, like when he was or wasn't able to get interviews with his like features. Yeah. And how, you know, he has to kind of like make do with other things he knows, or like going to events. Like he went and saw her speak in Chicago and can like comment on that event, but he really only got to like speak with her a little bit here and there.
Yeah. So this is when he's still kind of small time. Yeah. And he's trying to make do with the information he can get. And whereas, spoiler alert, the last essay is he gets to sit in a room alone with the president. Yeah. Yeah, and then like, he gets to go to like the BET like big party they throw at the White House, which I just loved his recounting of that, and like it was a really great like kind of peek inside like what that event was. But then you also kind of get to be with Coates along that journey where he like couldn't even get more than a minute of Michelle Obama's time when he was like early stages features writing. Of course, she was also like doing her duty as the first lady. I mean, maybe at that point she was campaigning. No, I think she was already first lady by then. Okay, essay number 3. Why do so few Blacks study the Civil War? In the letters from the third year, Ta-Nehisi Coates is writing about how his blog is growing and kind of the community of people that are basically like his classroom. Yeah. Like he doesn't have the formal education setting of sitting in a room with peers and discussing something you read, but he does have this blog, like his corner of the internet, where he jokes that it was like just for his dad to start. Like his dad was like the #1 supporter of his blog, which is adorable. But it was kind of like his space to kind of try out new ideas and like perfect his craft. And like it's also, side note, like as a writer reading this, and he's doing like literally all the things everyone always says, like
put your stuff out there, you start writing, and you don't even have like your audience set yet, like keep pitching yourself, it'll build.
Yeah.
He kind of like walks
he walks you through it.
The writer's journey to getting paid. What I particularly liked about the notes here is how much he's just like so open about how much he still had to learn.
Yeah.
And he's very open about the fact that it wasn't a solo effort. He wasn't some intellectual off on his own, just absorbing thoughts and sitting and having deep thoughts and then writing about them. It was like engaging in the comments on his blog of people being like, hey, you should read this next, or like, I agree with you here but I disagree with you here. Have you looked into this? And you can really see it come to fruition in the later essays when he's like citing up a storm of like, these are all the scholars and researchers and historians that I've read to flesh out this essay, and he kind of speaks to that in this like intro part. Yeah,
he basically uses this blog as like to uncover the things he was never taught in school, as like an invitation to people who know more than him, like please tell me what I don't know. And so this question of why don't African Americans study the Civil War feels like he's really starting to ask his own questions and like do his own, like this is a question, this is a very personal question. He's like, why didn't I care about this until right now? And what narrative do I have about the Civil War versus the narrative that the country as a whole or that white America has about the Civil War? And he's like, really, this is where you see him start to peel back the narrative a little bit, just a tiny bit, to kind of see how much he's missing, which is very cool to watch. And I mean, he basically says like the Civil War is a story for white people, like the quote unquote story of the Civil War, of this like great tragedy or inability to compromise or whatever bullshit is like
the overemphasis on like preserving the Union and like instead of, I remember like in school, we were just trying to unpack this last night, Julie and I, when we were talking about this, of like, at some point I internalized the Civil War was about slavery. And then I got older and was in like, I don't know which grades, probably junior high, high school, where they're like, well, that's like the simplified version. It's really not about slavery. It's about these other things. And it's about like inability to compromise, like differences of, it's like power struggles, like all these different things, instead of like, no, it's like our country was built on the back of slaves. And some people were saying, let's not do that anymore. And others were saying, well, that's all of our money. And no, like we don't care. Like I don't know, by trying to like make it more complex or more nuanced, even though this whole conversation is about how nuance and context is important. I'm not saying it's not important, that those weren't part of it, but it felt like almost a push to rewrite the narrative of what we thought the Civil War was about, to tell us, no, it wasn't about slavery. At least that's what I got from it. Yeah. I don't want to pinpoint a history teacher because I don't know what they were trying to teach, but that's what I got from it.
I definitely got the feeling of like, this is a much more cynical view of like, people in power actually didn't really give a shit about slaves. They were more concerned about money and power, was kind of the way that I remember internalizing it. I think what he was trying to do was to, at least maybe it was just in my own head, what I was trying to do was to deconstruct the idea that the North was somehow, were better people, were better white people, deconstruct the myth of the like, the nice white person, right? And like they were really just concerned about money. But what the connection that history teachers failed to make was our money was slavery. Our money, that's where it came from. Yeah. And we didn't really say that part. Yeah. It was like our wealth was built entirely on the backs of enslaved people. So it was deconstructing one myth, but it was distancing, it was creating a new one, and it was sort of playing into the Southern states' rights narrative, and so it was kind of complicated. History's tough, man.
Yeah, I think that's part of it too, is that we learned history from a very young age. Yeah. And it's important. But our brains are still developing. Right. And we're still like, especially even in high school still, you're still kind of in that black and white, like, this is right, this was wrong, this happened, this didn't happen. And it gets more complicated because you do need to learn more of the nuance, but sometimes we're not quite there yet.
Right. It's a lot of unlearning what you think you know, I feel like, is just the process of history. Similar to this book. Let me see.
The Legacy of Malcolm X.
The Legacy of Malcolm X. That's where he talks about, I really liked this quote in Notes from the Fourth Year. That is where I began as a writer in hip hop. It was the first literature I ever knew. I really liked that. Let me see if I like this quote. It says, quote about art on page 88. That's what's in my notes. So he's talking about Nas, the rapper. That was how I wanted to write, with weight and clarity, without sanctimony and homily. I could not even articulate why. I guess if forced, I would have mumbled something about, quote-unquote, truth. What I know is that by then I had absorbed an essential message, an aesthetic, from Nas and from the hip-hop of that era. Art was not an after-school special. Art was not motivational speaking. Art was not sentimental. It had no responsibility to be hopeful or optimistic, or make anyone feel better about the world. It must reflect the world in all its brutality and beauty, not in hopes of changing it, but in the mean and selfish desire to not be enrolled in its lie, to not be co-opted by the television dreams, to not ignore the great crimes all around us. I really liked that. Mm-hmm. It explains a lot about who he is as a writer, and you can see why maybe trying to get a college degree didn't really work for him, because he's just like, this is all lies, this is all like, this doesn't matter, you know. He's trying to find the truth of everything, but he doesn't really like this essay either.
Themes from the first 4 years.
Themes from the first 4 years. I don't like this.
I got better.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think having that, like, his critique of his own writing going in of, here's what I was trying to do, you know, I think I made a stretch too far, because I was just, like, really set on what I wanted to say. Helped in the reading of it, too, because there's parts where I'm like, I am getting a little lost. Like, I don't really think this is saying something per se, but it's really beautifully written. Like, I think this was one of the essays where I really felt like he was, like, finding his, like, the rhythm of his voice.
Yeah.
And now he needed to kind of, like, marry the two. Like, the well-researched ideas, the thoughtful interviews, and just the writing. Yeah.
Yeah, he doesn't really land anywhere with the Legacy of Malcolm X essay. In the way he describes it is he's, like, wrestling with these ideas that he can't quite reconcile in himself. And I sort of saw it as, like, he's trying to bring together pessimism and hope, and he doesn't quite know how, and he doesn't know why he wants to or why he can't. Moving on from here is a real turning point when he finally starts to find answers.
Yeah.
Okay. Then we get to possibly my favorite section of the entire book. It's Notes from the Fifth Year. This is kind of the turning point. He starts to contemplate his legacy as a writer. He's made quite a name for himself, and he finally has, like, financial stability from his writing, which is a huge deal. But he's also starting to think about what his goals are, what he wants to be as a writer. He makes all these references to his heroes, like namely Baldwin, Ida B. Wells mostly. And there's this one section that I am so obsessed with. I want it on my tombstone. It's really long. It would not fit on a tombstone.
I was going to say, what kind of tombstone are you going to get? A monument. It's like the Washington Monument, just inscribed with the entire essay collection.
So he says, all of these heroes had failed to cajole and coerce the masters of America. Their ambition of a better world had been frustrated. This was the story of my ancestors, the story I expected for myself. These were not stories of hope, but were they without import? If Celia, Margaret, and Ida had failed to help the country at large locate its morality, they had succeeded in living by their own, and that was all they could control. Within the small and narrow frame of their lives, all they had was their own conscience, their own story. The lessons they passed down were not about an abstract hope, an unknowable dream. They were about the power and necessity of immediate defiance. This is where I joined them. I understood the problem of Black enslavement in America as twofold. First, there is the actual enslavement and all that had followed from it, from Reconstruction to Jim Crow to mass incarceration. But then there was the manufactured story that was told to ennoble and sanctify that enslavement. This was where these heroes took their stand. I was a writer like Ida, and I felt, even in this time, a century later, that I too would gather my words and scream into the roaring waves, because to scream was to defy the story, and that defiance had meaning, no matter that the waves kept coming, would come maybe forever. The masters could lie to themselves, lie to the world, but they would never force me to lie to myself. Damn. He's finally sort of found, who he is as a writer. He's gained a lot of confidence where he puts himself in the legacy of these really famous people. He sees his work as kind of a prophet in a way where, no one's gonna listen to you and you're not actually gonna make any change, but you have to live by your own code and you have to fight back against the story in your own life. Mm-hmm. And I really loved that.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear what he's kind of writing against and what he's writing with. He talks about how his writing started reaching a wider and wider audience, and he's kind of, in some ways it's like, oh, is this the cliche struggle of the emerging celebrity who doesn't know what to do with themselves because everyone wants a part of them or to work with them on something, but there's this other layer of what I'm trying to say is not what people are really wanting to hear,
right?
But they still like me. I'm confused, and I think it's really beautiful that he struggles with this and addresses it head on before you even get into these essays that continue to advance his career.
Yeah,
and you have that understanding that he's not writing as someone who's oh, look at me, I'm good at what I do.
Yeah.
I put myself up there with Ida B. Wells, but yeah, I put myself up with Ida B. Wells because we're screaming into the waves that are coming at us no matter what we do. And honestly, I think it's his atheism in a way is really coming forward of no one's here to save us.
Yeah.
And all I can do is write about it. But I will keep writing because that's what I'm going to do. I think it also makes, I don't know if he would say, I don't want to speak for him if he's this gave him more courage or less concern of what people thought of him, but perhaps when he stopped writing to change minds, he started writing his best work. Or when he stopped writing to prove himself, he started writing his best work. I don't know. Those are just guesstimations from afar from what I read.
But it also seemed like it's just a product of time and dedicated effort and research and reading the influences, the people he wanted to emulate.
So the ending of Notes from My Fifth Year, before he gets into his essay, Fear of a Black President, the very last sentence is, what does the story you tell matter if the world is set upon hearing a different one? And this made me think a lot, because we talk a lot in this podcast on the stories we tell ourselves and how important it is that we kind of analyze what we're taking in, and then also kind of almost the therapeutic way that we can tell ourselves narratives about ourselves, our world, our history. But then I was kind of thinking there's this layer of privilege to those conversations, because whether I don't know, is it because we're small and mostly anonymous to the world, the stories we tell ourselves, there isn't an onslaught of people telling us something differently to us as individuals, but then also this white privilege that we can continue to tell ourselves the stories that we want to, and the majority of the world is going to say, okay, cool. The majority of the world doesn't look at us and throw other stories on us, or let you say the story but then disregard it completely. I don't know. I had a lot of thoughts about that.
Yeah. You start to see the tragedy. As he gets bigger, he starts to kind of question, what am I actually doing? Am I accomplishing anything? And the most important thing for him is clearly, like, I have to do this for myself. But once people start paying attention, you see this in notes from the 6th year, where he asks himself, like, why do white people like what I write? He has some guys on the subway, some white men on the subway, like, tell him that they really liked his essay on Case for Reparations. And on one level, he's just like, I am a writer. You are not supposed to address me in public. I am invisible. I live in my words. Like, don't look at my face. But he also has this level of, like, the goal of my writing is to completely unravel everything you ever thought you knew about who you are as a white person and your country. And you like it? Am I doing my job? You know? Yeah. And he has this kind of crisis of, like, is it working, or am I failing? Like, he can't tell, you know, wrestling with that, like, pride of, like, wow, I'm being recognized for my work, it's finally paying off, but also, what does that mean? What am I saying it right? He also has issues, like, because he's considered a public intellectual now, so he's, like, called upon all the time to, like, comment on anything to do with race. You have to ask Ta-Nehisi Coates his opinion, and he's like, I'm just one dude.
Yeah.
Like, you can do your own research. You know, this was just a project for me, and all of a sudden everyone's listening. And there's this kind of fear of, like, are we reading the same thing? Are we seeing the same information? And if we are, then when a white person sees that information, what story are they telling themselves? Mm-hmm. And because their narrative is the one that's ultimately going to be the one that gets used in public policy, in government, in daily life, in not daily life, but, like, dominant culture. So anyway, fear of a black president.
Yes. Fear of a black president is in some way like a feature piece on Obama, mm-hmm. Specifically what his presidency looks like after the murder of Trayvon Martin, mm-hmm. and how he kind of opens with, well, the first line, the irony of President Barack Obama is best captured in his comments on the death of Trayvon Martin and the ensuing fray. He writes how the world first responded to Trayvon Martin's death, and then as soon as Barack Obama said something about it, then it became, like, something totally different. Like, it seemed, what's the word he uses? Uncontroversial at first. And then when Obama says, like, if I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon. Mm-hmm. And it's almost, in a way, as if white Americans realized their president was black.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is kind of like an exploration of what could a black president be. And until we had one, there was, like, not even really a conversation. Like, he talks about how it was a joke in a lot of ways, and it was seen as, like, something that would maybe never happen, and then it did. And he also kind of weighs the nuance of having a black president, but then it's, like, again, this he has to be twice as good narrative around everything Obama does, where, and especially in light after the fact with Trump, when there's just so many things that Trump does, and we're like, why was he there for as long as he was? Like, how did he even get elected? Like, we question those things, but it's kind of like, well, we know why.
Yeah.
Because he's white, and he can do those things. But this is the essay where he first starts, well, not first, but dives more deeply into exploring what having a black president, what kind of narrative Americans tell themselves with a black president, whether those are white Americans or black Americans, like how they perceive the black president of the United States.
Yeah. And, like, just by him existing as a black man in the White House, every single decision he made, every position he took was racialized in a way that if a white man had said it, it would have been considered objective or just the right thing to do. But suddenly it's about race. Yeah, the sentence that kind of summed it up for me was, thus the myth of twice as good that makes Barack Obama possible also smothers him. And then we get into the meat and potatoes of this book. It's like easily a third.
Yeah,
of
what
the book.
is it?
Just the last 3 essays.
Yeah. More than half the book's lost through essays, and then there's an epilogue in addition.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
Woo! Okay. We're going to talk a lot more in depth about the case for reparations, so we will not give it its due, what it deserves in this podcast that we are recording right now.
This episode.
I wrote down so many quotes. The thing that's really jarring, I think, is how high up it goes. Like when it comes to housing or bank loans or policing or anything, like how it's all the way in the very top in the federal government that Black people are systemically excluded. It's not just Chicago. He uses Chicago as a starting point. You learn a lot about Chicago in this book, which I really appreciated since we live here. But that's sort of a case study and maybe one of the most extreme examples. But like, he has this line, the FHA, so it's the Federal Housing Administration, adopted a racial policy that could well have been culled from the Nuremberg laws. That is a direct quote that chilled me to my bones. And the fact that there's an escaped slave clause in the Constitution, and like,
I didn't realize that was in the Constitution.
It's in the Constitution. Like it's everywhere. You know what I mean? Like if you want to try and dig it out of our political system, you gotta dig all the way to the foundation.
Yeah. And one thing, I think it came up in the Civil War essay as well as in this one, is like how long time is, which is such a weird phrase to say. But when we think about, it's been 150, 160 years since the Civil War, really that's not very long at all.
No.
And to think that the first slaves from Africa were brought to the continent like 250 years before that, before the Civil War, and to think we're only 60 years from the Civil Rights Movement, like all these like time frames where the way we were taught history, the way we digest history, the way we talk about our own narrative as Americans, it seems like those are so far away. It is so distant and does not have, things are different now. Like, it's not that way anymore. And changes have happened, but to say that everything's, like, all right and good and, like, enough time has passed, like, water under the bridge, like, no. It hasn't been that long. And to see, it wasn't just, like, the slaves were freed and then we were fine. And then, we still had some problems, so we dealt with it later. It's, like, it was, like, 100 years of continued oppression in so many ways, and being told, like, no, you can't live here, you can't buy a house here. If you do, like, all the predatory lending that happened, the contract loans where you buying your house on contract basically meant someone else owned it and you just had to pay it off eventually with insane interest rates, and if you missed a payment you lost everything. Like, that was going on for 100 plus years. Civil rights movement still didn't fix everything. We got some new laws, but like you see a lot in the direct quotations from, especially in the mass incarceration essay, direct quotations from primary sources of our government and people in charge, very well knowing that this is a racist policy. We're just not calling it anymore because it's past 1964 and we can't say that anymore. But like knowing exactly what they're doing. It's heavy stuff. It's a lot. And we can't study our history in bits and parts and draw a line at a certain date and be like, that's the end of that. Close the chapter, close the book. And I think one of the great examples in here was the section, "There will be no reparations from Germany," which is in quotes. And again, this is something that I'm like, well, technically I think I learned some about, post-war Germany, different trials that went down in Israel, and I kind of know about that stuff, but again, to read some of these primary sources and secondary sources. So a historian wrote, throughout the 50s, West German officialdom encouraged a comfortable view of the German past in which the Wehrmacht was heroic, while Nazis were in a minority and properly punished. So it's kind of like the history was written as like, the Nazis were just kind of a part of it. We took care of it. We're fine now. And not addressing the way that the entire country was implicated in this and what was owed the Jewish people.
Even thinking about like was there before our country was. It's so baked in to everything. And so all you have to do is poke a tiny bit. You just have to barely scratch the surface of any kind of government policy anywhere, and you will find racism. Like, you just have to go, tink, tink, housing policy. Oh, look, redlining. There it is. Like, we didn't have to go very far.
Mm-hmm.
And also the line, today Chicago is one of the most segregated cities in the country, a fact that reflects assiduous planning. That line is particularly important for me because it's like, this is on purpose. It's not just, whoops, you know, like unconscious bias and you didn't realize you were being discriminatory, which is, you know, very real things that can happen in the workplace and, you know, society today, whatever. But in terms of public policy, in terms of laws, it was on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to acknowledge that. I think you see that in the next essay quite a bit as well. Where, like you said, like people knew exactly what they were doing, and they were doing it on purpose, and they were saying these narratives in a way that made white people feel fine about their racism,
Mm-hmm.
And carrying on without explicitly stating their position.
But overall, like I said, this was the first essay I had read of Ta-Nehisi Coates, and if you haven't read this collection, or if you're like, wow, this sounds like a lot of reading. Honestly, I would say you could even just start with this one. And it gives a lot of history, a lot of context, a lot of weaving together of different ideas to make his points. But it's also very approachable. And he uses a lot of like actual people and telling their stories as like an example of what was happening to a lot of people. And I think this is a good essay in conversation with Red at the Bone that we read on the podcast a few weeks ago, when we talked about generational wealth. And you can see an example of like they were not able to create like these two individuals he talks with specifically, they had to work 2 or 3 jobs. They like where they had to cut corners was the electricity bill, the food bill, extra things for their kids. Like one of the women speaks of all her children were really creative and wanted to take dance lessons and art lessons and music lessons, and they couldn't. And like that's the kind of all the little pieces of generational wealth that get lost with discriminatory housing practices.
And you see that I think he has a line in the next essay. Basically, middle class white people pass down wealth, and middle class black people pass down debt. Is basically his line. So like technically their incomes are the same, but it's not the same. And because the next essay he's talking in relation to mass incarceration and the way that was just a new way to basically practice slavery and how it ripped a hole in the black community. And that's sort of an example of how African Americans are prohibited from flourishing, even if they get to a certain level of success. Generations of debt that they're fighting against. Yeah, I feel like these 2 big essays, Case for Reparations and Mass Incarceration, are sort of the culmination of all of his work from a writing standpoint. These 2 essays feel like a culmination of his style, and his sort of goals, but also that the sort of wrestling that he was doing in those earlier essays and all the research and the uncovering that he was starting to do. These 2 essays really lay it all out there. They're extremely long and detailed and very thoroughly researched and sourced. And he's like, here, I finished it. You know, this is what I was building, and I've finally come to terms with the narrative of my country and what's actually going on behind the scenes. And so you sort of feel that culminate in those 2 essays.
Okay, so we talked about how the kind of arc of this whole collection being a tragedy, and the writer Shonta Grimes on her Medium. She has a Medium article about how to write a tragic story arc. The arc of a sad story can be very different. Like, even if it's very sad, you know, you might end at kind of like a hopeful moment, or, you know, things are not better, but better, like, not great, but better than they were kind of deal. But a tragedy, she notes, distinctly ends with either the protagonist dies or are worse than dead. And I feel like that's kind of the arc that you reach in these is not a very hopeful one. It's kind of like he is early on kind of realizing there isn't, like, he's not writing with, like, I'm going to change things.
Yeah.
And he doesn't end with, I'm dead, I'm done writing, but it kind of like, this is worse than you thought.
Yeah.
That kind of, like, worse, quote unquote, worse than death. It's worse than you thought. You thought life is difficult for Black people. Let's look at why reparations are necessary. And he's going to write this essay even if he doesn't think people are actually going to listen and maybe even pay reparations someday from the government level, considering we can't even pass a bill to, like, the House floor to even consider studying it. Like, it isn't happening, but he's, like, doing it anyways. And it's kind of like this not really futile attempt. I don't know. It's complicated because he's not giving up because he's still writing, but he's, like, peeling back. And you thought this was a story of American, we're on the climb, like, we have a Black president, like, this is American progress. Yeah. And he peels it back, like, this is the tragedy.
Yeah, I agree that, so in the last section, you have notes from the 8th year, and my president was Black. And he does sort of let go a little bit. There's this sense of, like, the work that I was trying to do for myself is done. I found the answer I was looking for, and it's worse than we all thought. And it's probably not going to change. And in his real, you know, in the political sphere, Trump has just won as sort of a very dramatic reaction against Obama's presidency. And we're kind of right back where we were after the Civil War. There was like 8 years where Black people served in Congress. There were like, they were establishing businesses, doing things. And then Jim Crow laws, and then the KKK, and then everything whoosh, came back to take it all away. And like, that's the real story of America.
Yeah, so maybe essay 6 and 7 are the unveiling, and then like the essay 8 and the epilogue are like, and this is the tragedy, you know, like.
It feels like the denouement. It's like he found what he was looking for, and he's like, what can you do about this except scream into the waves? And in a way, he kind of lets himself stop screaming for a bit. And he's like, I'm going to go write some comic books. Just take a little break, you know, because like, take care of him, a little self-care. That's, My President is Black is so heartbreaking because he's writing it from after the 2016 election. He knows Trump has won. But the interview with Obama is from before. And I think, like, the very first line is, like, he can't win.
Yeah.
And you're just like, Obama's so confident in his country. And he's so confident in American decency. And you're like, but you're wrong. How did you get this far and not see it? And it's, how do you keep going with that when you see what your country did to you and to, like, how? I feel like their interview between Coates and Obama is, like, obviously the culmination of this period of writing because he's sitting in the room with the president and it's just so, you know, meeting of the minds, but it's also a clash between, like, kind of optimism and reality, and you see which one is right.
I think he makes the distinction that Ta-Nehisi Coates is like, I thought Trump wouldn't win. Obama thought Trump can't win or couldn't win. It was like a distinguished like a little nuance of the words.
The last line, though, he sort of ends on this like heartbreaking image of the Obamas leaving the White House. And he just, the very last sentence of the book is rising up from fear, smiling, waving, defying despair, defying history, defying gravity. You just want to cry.
Yeah, that's the end of My President Was Black.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, not the end of the book.
There's a lot in this book that I think read today. And then it's also interesting reading this 4 years later. Because he ends with Trump entering the presidency. And there's things that you're like, oh man, you don't know how bad it gets. And then there's also like, and you also didn't know that he wasn't going to get reelected.
Right.
And so I guess we kind of have to continually live our current lives with kind of like a glance back as we like carry our history forward. And when we see something happening in present day, we shouldn't ever we will question like, why is this happening, or how could this happen? But we can't stop there. We have to then like, okay, let's look back at the people who've been talking about this for a while. Let's look back at the people who are studying, or let's pull a Ta-Nehisi Coates and just pull out our own resources and primary sources and start doing the research of like, how did we get here? Because there's always an answer. There's always somewhere behind us to point to. Nothing is in a vacuum when it comes to history.
Yeah.
And present day.
There's some quotes about Biden in the mass incarceration essay that are particularly prescient and depressing, to say the least. And, you know, decisions he's made that he's never really had to answer for. And Coates really had no idea, like, what was going to happen when he wrote about Biden's decisions. But, you know, he was still a prominent political figure. He was the vice president.
Yeah, I think there was even a statement, like, if Biden should run for president, like, he will have to answer for this. And it's like, well, we kind of didn't really make him answer for that.
Because he came after Trump, and we were just so relieved. Like, oh my God, maybe we won't all perish. Maybe some of us will make it.
Yeah. How could he have known that Biden would be running against Trump for a presidency during a global pandemic when we're all just like, oh my gosh, give us a leader who believes that this is happening.
Yeah, that'd be a great start.
So,
as you said, context is super important, and we need to be constantly evaluating our present with the realities of our past. And, like, kind of armed with this knowledge, we can continue to fight against the narratives that we've been given and that we assume, and how we think about our own stories. It's a really important, like, constant process, you know? The work is never done, as they say.
So, after reading this, whether it's in part some of the essays or the whole collection, what do you recommend that people check out next?
Literally anything by James Baldwin or Toni Morrison.
I'm thinking James Baldwin has to be a companion piece with one of these essays.
Yes.
I think that's what our next move is.
I think we're definitely going to bring it out. I also watched the documentary I Am Not Your Negro, which is Samuel L. Jackson reading a transcript of an unfinished essay that James Baldwin wrote, where it was like a proposal for a book he was going to write that he never got around to before he died, about Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., and Medgar Evers. It intercuts with footage of all of them interacting and Baldwin's speeches and a few other things that are really incredible. And then also Ava DuVernay's documentary 13th on Netflix, specifically about the history of mass incarceration. She interviews Angela Davis a lot in that one. Very, very good. Watched it in college. Kind of exploded everything I thought I knew.
My recommendations. The 1619 Project, which was published by New York Times Magazine. It was developed by Nicole Hannah-Jones. 1619 being the year that the first African slaves were brought to the continent. And then just a lot of essays and writing and just a collaboration of really great Black artists and writers, giving a new narrative or a more realistic narrative to a lot of history as we've been taught it. Oh, the next question is a video series. I think you could call it that, by Austin Channing Brown, who her newsletters where I originally came across Ta-Nehisi Coates. She is joined with Chi-Chi Okwa and Jenny Booth Potter. I can't even read my own writing today. Okay. And then lastly, a podcast, The Humanity Archive, which I recently came across, takes one event or a historical figure and kind of goes really in depth with an eye towards the histories that are often forgotten or put aside of Black people and other marginalized communities.
Okay.
It is a Saturday night. We are a little tired.
We are very tired.
We have done many thoughts.
Yeah. There's so many thoughts to have about this one book. That's why we're going to come back to it, because we just barely scratched the surface. Oh my god. What is bringing you joy, Victoria?
Okay, so if you follow us on Instagram, you might have learned that I accidentally ordered a 5-pound bag of carrots.
It's bigger than you think.
It is huge. Like, you like, okay, they're not baby carrots. They're like the normal, just pulled out of the ground carrots.
Yeah. Just pulled out of the ground.
Usually when you buy those, you buy like probably a pound, a half pound. You get like a nice cute little bag with like 6 of them. I bought 5 pounds. I bought 5 pounds of carrots.
Oh my god.
Because I ordered my groceries and didn't pay attention to the weight. Anyways, so thank you to all of our Instagram friends who have sent me recipes and ideas of how to use them. We are slowly whittling down our carrot supply. Particularly excited about the carrot cake muffins cupcakes ?
They're very good.
From Chelsea, shared her recipe, literally like handwritten on a note card, which was adorable. I don't know where she found it originally, or I would cite it. But thank you, Chelsea. They're delicious.
And I also appreciate, I did not contribute to the making of these, but I have eaten them and they're great.
Yes. Oh, and my other currently obsessed, we got a new board game in the house.
Yes.
Called Wingspan. It's another Stonemaier game.
It's about birds.
It's about birds. It's so great.
It's delightful.
It's very delightful. You're like bird watching and collecting birds and eggs, and you have to feed them.
It's so fun. The board is like a little like orthonographer's notebook, journal, whatever. It's great. Okay, I have learned to play the ukulele. That is what is bringing me joy this week. I subscribed to KiwiCo over the winter and built the ukulele, and then it was extremely out of tune for a very long time, and I had to wait for the strings to like stretch out a little bit. And so it's just been sitting on various chairs throughout the house, waiting for me to pick it up. And this week I finally did, and I learned some chords, and I learned a song, and I've been practicing, and I'm getting my little calluses, which I haven't had since middle school when I played the cello, and I'm very excited. And then also when I was finding my notes for this book, because I read this way back at early pandemic, I was looking through all my journals for last summer, and it was bleak, friends. It was extremely bleak. And
if y'all don't remember summer 2020, it was quite bleak.
It was so dark, and I had this sense of like pride and gratitude for myself for like working through that a day at a time and taking care of myself and like relying on my resources and, you know, getting to where I am now mentally and emotionally and health-wise. Like, so much has changed since then, and it kind of boggles my mind. And I just wanted to leave a little encouraging vibes for everyone that, like, you've come a really long way and you've lived through, like, one of the hardest years in human history, and you're still here. So that's my little moment of joy.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Book Club with Julia and Victoria. Chime in with your own thoughts and recommendations on Instagram at bookclubwithjv or through the contact form on our website, www.bookclubwithjv.com. Our website is also where you can find show notes for this episode, which include links to any of the recommendations we gave or other tidbits we mentioned. Make sure to follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're currently listening, and leave us a 5-star review on Apple while you're there. This episode was co-hosted and produced by myself, Victoria Bruick, along with Julia Clausen. Our music is composed by Greg Bruick. Our logo was designed by Gabby Febland, and Rebecca Gesney is our project manager. We'll catch you all on our next episode. Happy reading!